This last panel is going to be really fun for me to introduce because it involves my former boss and mentor, Secretary Hannah Scandera, who's going to be leading us on a teacher quality discussion for the last hour. Hannah, I tried hard to not have to read your bio on paper after reading everyone else's all day. Most known for being Secretary of Education under Governor Susana Martinez for 6.5 years, where I had the privilege of being one of her deputy secretaries. But these days, editor-in-chief at The Line, CEO of Mile High Strategies, visiting professor at Pepperdine, and Hannah, I know you're doing 4 other things, but those are the ones I wanted to highlight.
It's all good.
Folks know she spent time in Florida and the United States Department of Education before her tenure. I got a chance to work alongside her for a 1.5 years, and it was an incredible 1.5 years in Santa Fe. So Hannah, we're talking teacher quality, also one of my favorite topics, with some panelists that are some of my favorite people. So Hannah, take it away.
Terrific. Well, thank you, CR, and welcome Kate, Mike, Michelle, and Ben. Great to be here with you and excited to hear from each one of you and your expertise. It's been a full day, and so we are definitely on for the last session and obviously the most invigorating and exciting conversation of the day. We just wrapped, as you know, on a conversation around technology. And I kind of look at this as technology and teachers being 2 really big conversations right now in the space we're in based on the pandemic. And when we think about levers for our kids and impact and change. So great to have you all with us and great to be here. I'm going to start off, Kate, with a question for you. Andreas Fleischer of the OECD in Paris, the quality of an education system can never exceed the quality of its teachers. And if that's true, which I believe it is true, where do you see America's efforts to improve teacher quality in the year 2020? As we this year and forward, what do you see on the horizon?
Well, it's not our best. It's not the best time for teacher quality. That's an issue. I'd say that we have been in full retreat for the past several years. You're seeing a remarkable decline in entry standards into the profession, with states dropping tests that tell you whether a candidate is literate. So you've seen that. You've seen evaluation, which made so much progress, meaningful evaluation systems, which had made so much progress. And it was too soon to tell what the results might be before states as quickly withdrew from them as they had adopted them. So that in itself is bad news for teacher quality. We saw some momentum on pay with across the board pay increases, which were long overdue, but we're still not seeing the kind of strategic use of pay that is essential for any vibrant profession. So I would say this is not, there's nothing that's been good about the year 2020, and I'm not finding a lot about teacher quality that's good in 2020, other than I am heartened by the renewed attention to reading as something that is should be a focus for all. And I'm glad that the pandemic has not sunk that momentum and I think Black Lives Matter has helped to invigorate and remind us, since so many Black and brown children are the victims of instruction where they do not learn how to read. So that, to me, that's the silver lining these days, but I find most of what's being debated fear-provoking.
Mm-hmm. I feel like you missed my question. I said efforts to improve teacher quality. I said that tongue in cheek. I mean, in short, you did close with some, you said silver lining. I don't think that silver lining is very thick. I think it's a pretty thin silver lining. If just to kind of push a little bit on this, so it's not very encouraging what's happening when it comes to teacher quality, et cetera, in the year 2020. Do you think there'll be things coming out of 2020? And I would ask, what are you hoping? Realistically hoping in regards to teacher quality, and what could come out of this that could give us a reason to believe there's a brighter future, just candidly, around teacher quality going forward?
Well, I'm actually a big booster on many fronts for the long-term benefits of a worldwide pandemic, not discounting the short-term horror of it. And I do think we will see major changes in a lot of things, but most of which I'm not sure I could anticipate at this point. But I do think, for example, we know it's going to be a lot easier to evaluate teachers, and we can do a much better job evaluating student teachers using technology and getting over hurdles like that, though they seem somewhat unimportant in the face of the nightmare we're confronting at the moment. But I do think that the ease of which we all have had to grow accustomed to doing things this way rather than in person will help teacher preparation and will help teacher evaluation if we can just muster the political guts to go back to it.
Thank you. Yes, and I feel like a theme of the day, and probably a theme in most of our education world, is mustering those guts, right, to actually take on some of these things. I don't know that that's a consistency in the midst of a lot of change. I'll say that. Michelle, I'm going to shift to you. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos said, teaching is a tremendous responsibility. Teachers have little of the thing that makes our country great, freedom. How do you respond to her statement? And do you think the pandemic alters your perspective on this at all?
So I think it brings up an incredibly important point, and one that we've struggled with in education for a really long time, and more broadly, I think governmental entities struggle with a lot, right? So what we know is it can't be the wild, wild west. You can't have teachers out there just having complete and utter freedom to teach whatever they want, whenever they want to. There have to be some guide rails, right? You have to know when you're teaching a certain grade, here are the standards that we are expecting in terms of what kids should know and be able to do at the end of this year. Here are the ways that we're going to measure whether or not kids are gaining those skills. So though there have to be some standardized infrastructure pieces in place for everyone. That said, teachers should have some freedoms within that, and in particular, effective teachers, right? You don't want to overprescribe, which I think is sometimes the easier thing to do, is to say, okay, everybody has to do this, and this is the way that we're going to do it. But I think our best teachers know that you have to, be able to understand when those teachable moments are happening, understand what particularly is going to motivate your kids that you may have in a particular community or in a particular year. And you have to trust those teachers to know and be able to assess those things, and to be able to then deliver instruction accordingly. But we have a really hard time with is sort of, how do you create that balance between having the guardrails and not over prescribing, and then knowing, sort of when and to which teachers do we give more freedom to, because we know that they're incredibly skilled, and they probably know better than anyone at the central office what is going to result in better outcomes for their kids. And when do we see that teachers are struggling, actually probably need a little bit more guidance on what to do. And in order to make those decisions, you have to have a pretty sophisticated system with really high quality people going in and looking at what's going on in the classroom and assessing those teachers. And that's hard, right? Because that's not just a checklist that you can go into the classroom and check the boxes. Are they doing this? Are they doing this? Are they doing this? But it requires a much higher degree of knowledge and sort of nuance. And it's just more difficult. But I think it's absolutely necessary. I mean, you know, some of the most magical educators that I have ever seen have taken completely unorthodox approaches to the way they impart knowledge to their kids and the way that they ensure that kids are gaining skills. And we never want to be in a world or a system in which those masterful teachers would not be able to do what they're doing. But again, on the flip side, you don't want to walk into classroom after classroom and see people who are sort of doing things that make absolutely no sense in terms of developmentally, like where kids are and what they should be able to do. So unfortunately, and you'll probably hear me saying this a lot today, like the answer is in the middle, right? It's not what I think too often happens in education is that we get to these like super polarized extremes, and then you're either in this camp or you're in that camp, and camps are always fighting about who's right and who's wrong, but the real answer is always in the middle and sort of a more nuanced, reasonable conversation. And I think that's the case as it pertains to teacher autonomy and freedom as well.
Well said. Thank you. So I'm going to switch to our economists, Ben and Mike. Research often shows that smaller class sizes enhance quality, but it's difficult to put into practice given the financial implications. So Ben, I'll start with you. Would you say that public schools are adequately staffed?
Well, first I want to say thanks to Paul for putting on this great conference, and PepG and Ed Choice and Robert Enlow, and Hannah, thanks for your leadership in the real world and here. Public schools have never had better staffing. Fiscal year 2018 is the most recent data. There's 7.7 students per full-time equivalent employee. Never been better. 10 years from now, it's going to be better again. 10 years after that, it's going to be better again. This has been going on for 70 years. We've been adding staffing to public schools. And if there's a big COVID relief bill from the Congress and the president, and they give money to states and school districts, they're going to add more staff again.
Okay, so as you did say, they've never been better staffed. You could say they've never had more staffing. I think the question on better, if we equate that with effectiveness, begins to erode a little bit, at least from my vantage point. So just to push a little bit there. Mike, do you think, and I think there's some good data on this, so we'll look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. Is it harder to get better teachers at schools serving largely disadvantaged student populations? And I'm going to add to that question a little bit. In the midst of the point in time that we are at right now with COVID, et cetera, is it harder or easier? And we can have an opinion about it, but what are you seeing? Is it harder or easier to get better teachers at schools serving largely disadvantaged student populations historically, and then, you know, fast forward to present day? Do we see any difference because of the situation we're in? Oh, you're muted, Mike.
In order to save time, I'm just going to say, in answer to your first question, is it harder to get teachers into challenging schools? Yes, it's always been true. If I might, may I go slightly off script here? Because I want to put something up here, and follow up on Ben's point here. Can I do a share screen? I want to put a chart up. Can I do that? Is that going to work? Yes, it will. Maybe. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is Ben's story. Okay, so So, you know, we've had, over my career, we've had 5,000 panels on teacher quality. But the reality is what's going on out in the world is teacher quantity, okay? So here I've put indexed starting in 1980, student enrollment, the number of teachers, full-time equivalent, and the number of non-teachers on public school payrolls. Now, we should have a whole nother panel on why the U.S. Department of Ed is so slow updating data, but the most recent is 2016. Actually, I can tell you with cell tracking data how many people went in and out of a school yesterday, but we can't get these updated. But that's a topic for another panel. But in any event, what you can see here is that the number of kids in public schools over this period from 1980 to present grew by about 25%. The number of teachers grew by about 45%, and the number of everyone else other than teachers grew by about 55%. So I just want to put in front of you, because we're going to talk about compensation later, you can't separate staffing and pay, right? They're two sides of the same coin. If revenues go up, and by the way, revenues per student over this period went from about $2,300 to $13,000 per student. But if revenues per student go up by 5%, you can either raise pay by 5%, or you can lower staffing ratios by 5%, or any combination of the two that adds up to 5%, okay? So here's what you see what the schools did. When given the resources, as Ben said, they could have chosen quality, but they chose quantity. And just to motivate this a little bit, the average salary of a teacher in fall 2016 was, at the end of this time panel, was $59,539. If the schools had simply allowed staff to grow at the same rate as student employment, or student enrollments, excuse me, then the average salary of a teacher in the United States today would be $100,000 and change, okay? So the schools made the decision of quantity over quality, okay? And that's been the decision they've made. So I think Ben's absolutely right. When you give them more money, they'll split it between the two. And we're going to come to this model, I don't think is efficient, and I don't think it's sustainable. So sorry to be so long-winded there, and I think I can undo. I hope I don't mess this up now in terms of getting rid of my screen. How do I do that? You would think I would know how to do this by now. Okay.
I'll keep us going as we
keep going.
Screens here. Ben, any reactions to that? Is that par for the course from your vantage point as well? And any additional color you would add?
It disappeared.
Yeah, I completely agree with Mike. I've done a lot of work on this for Ed Choice in my my staffing surge reports. And since 1992, public school spending per student, current spending per student, take out capital, take out debt service, current spending per student, adjusted for inflation, is up about 40%. Average teacher salaries are down 1%. And so one place this money went, as Mike just said, was the staffing surge. Yeah. And the public school system, it's a very specific preference, as Mike just said. It's for non-teachers. I've showed since 1992, they've increased district administrators by 124%. Students have only increased 20%. Other non-teachers have increased 2.5 times as fast as the increase in students. And yes, there's been modest cuts in class sizes since 1992. And I did this calculation for my state of Georgia. There are 16 layers of government that have a say in what goes on in my children's public school classroom. President, Congress, governor, courts, this and that. And so the equilibrium, the political, the legal, the bureaucratic equilibrium that we've seen over at least the last 70 years is that public schools get more money in real terms per student, teacher salaries are flat, and we add more bodies outside the classroom and staff. And so I don't know why we think that's going to change.
So let me open this up to the entire panel before we switch gears to a kind of a different topic in this teacher quality conversation. To that end, Ben, Mike, you've given us the data. It's seems pretty it's almost like a self-prophecy of what's coming. Is there anything that interrupts this? If there was a way to kind of say enough, there's a different way to do things that are better on this trajectory of increased staffing, not necessarily focused on teachers, and increased investment. Is there an interruption in that historical trend line? And what would it take? And I'm opening that to anyone on the panel. What would it take to interrupt that cycle?
I'll go. I've evolved on this over the years, and I worked in state government, full-time for 5 years and then part-time for like 5 years after that. I think it's going to take a change to a Milton Friedman style choice system. I don't know that parents would choose this. I don't think they would choose, stagnant teacher pay and just keep adding bodies outside the classroom. And so I don't know why we think the current system without some big change is going to have a different political equilibrium.
I might push back, not that I disagree with anything else you're saying, Ben, but I do think that many parents look at teachers' salaries and think they're not bad, they're better than mine. And more teachers means smaller class size. And so there is nothing that parents want to see more than tiny class sizes. And I know that that's not what you'd like to have. I mean, we know class size investments are not particularly productive, but parents love small class sizes. So it's not just the unions, it's also parents.
So I think when I was looking at Mike's slide, the first thought that popped into my head was, wow, I wonder what teachers would think if they saw this data, right? So if they knew, like, oh, if we just sort of keep staffing levels on par with student achievement level or student enrollment levels, you could be making $100,000 a year on average instead of 60. What would they think? But I think it'd be interesting for them to layer into that decision-making information what that additional staffing looks like. So if it's going to central office staff and more administrators, even maybe potentially more classroom teachers, I'm not sure that obviously teachers would be excited about that, but if they saw, for example, that it was going toward social workers, to guidance counselors, to school nurses or librarians, they might say yes, because those are things that have been lacking for some time, and we need to have that kind of staff in order to provide our kids with the holistic staffing models that they deserve, and to be able to meet their needs. So for me, it's always like, take it directly to teachers, show them this information, but give them the whole picture. I think it would be incredibly interesting to see what they said.
Anna, I'm sorry to go off script again, because this is coming up later, but your question was, what will put the brakes on this? I think one thing is insolvency of several teacher pension funds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this both really, Michelle, your point about, hey, what happens when you just shine a light on this in a way that everybody gets to see and know, and Kate, to your point, what are the what are the things that are pushing this right now? And actually, parents are a part of it, but I think we got a little more layered in that conversation around who are the additional folks that are being funded. To Michelle's point, it's true. I think we might see some really interesting nuanced responses. And Mike, I couldn't agree with you more. I think if we do see that insolvency occur, we'll see a lot of changes actually. That might inspire some real shifts in conversations, and just not in conversations, in reality. So I guess we'll stay tuned on that and see what happens as we move forward. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Kate, I'm coming to you on professional development and teacher preparation. So we know districts spend billions of dollars on PD and teachers and or districts. I mean, in New Mexico, we had districts who paid for teacher prep because or increased preparation because they knew it would pay out over time, or at least they thought it would. So lots of money, little improvement. So especially, I would say, not equitably across the country. And I think we're seeing this exacerbated pandemic and et cetera. How can we improve equitable access to PD and teacher preparation? What do you think, as you're looking at possibilities, what do you see and how would you tackle that?
I don't know that this is a problem of equity. I mean, unless you want to make the point that all teachers are equitably given bad PD, you know, I don't think it's stellar anywhere. But you know, we start. The first professional development that teachers get is when they do their clinical practice, or what we used to call student teaching. And talk about a train wreck. I mean, you know, there's nothing about student teaching that is done particularly well. Programs just want to place as many student teachers into schools as they can, regardless of whether anyone needs to hire those positions. And school districts just think they're doing a big favor to higher ed by agreeing to take on a student teacher without realizing their own self-interest in preparing and training. We spent 3 years trying to persuade school districts that it was in their self-interest to take student teaching seriously and do it well. And that means picking really good mentor teachers. And got very little traction for reasons I haven't figured out to this day. But this is not a culture that embraces continuing to learn, and which is ironic, right? But there are a lot of efforts out there to redo how we think about PD, and lesson study brought over from Asian models and other. I mean, I think teachers themselves have pushed back and started organizations that really have improved what is available to teachers. But it hasn't, the genesis of these improvements has not been school districts, which is
True.
Same old.
Yeah. Ben, I'm gonna switch to you on a related topic that what systemic improvements can be made to impact effectiveness at scale from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think Kate said exactly right. There's so many reports that say teachers aren't happy with their professional development. There's not much evidence that most professional development improves instruction and student outcomes. And then these reports say effective PD should look like fill in the blank, right? I think Michael Horn, who was in the last panel, and Mike Goldstein a couple of years ago in Education Next had a piece. And I think they're exactly right. What they said is, take the money we spend on professional development, give it in accounts to teachers, and let them choose their own, right? I'm a college professor. I decide what conferences I go to. You know, I mean, sometimes you have a budget, or sometimes, like this year, there's no money for travel, right? And there's no conferences to go to anyway. But, you know, let them choose. And what Mike and Mike proposed was very smart. They said, do a pilot in a state, do a randomized controlled trial, and then see if the teachers are picking better professional development that leads to higher student achievement. I think that's the way to go. And people were talking about unbundling earlier today. EdChoice has this big group of papers on unbundling. If you Google EdChoice unbundling, you'll see I wrote a piece about unbundling professional development, give accounts to teachers.
I want to jump in here. I'm not sure what the paper was written, but they might have taken that from Jason Kamras, who came up with this notion when we were in DC of, basically creating a teacher wallet, right? So let's take all the professional development money that we spend in the district, which at the time was pretty substantial, split it up amongst teachers, and teachers, know what they need, number one, and they know how they learn best, right? So some teachers are really going to benefit from taking a course. Others are going to want, a master teacher to come in and observe them doing something. Others are going to want to go and watch somebody do something, right? There's so many different strategies. But if we're doing really high quality evaluations and giving teachers the right feedback on where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then we're saying, okay, here are the dollars, right? And here's a catalog of potential opportunities, then empowering them to make those choices based on, what's the best fit for them, I think made a lot of sense back then. I haven't seen anything that's like a really aggressive move towards that, but I'm not sure why.
But Michelle, isn't that, how is that really fundamentally different from what school districts now do when they say, you go take a course and we'll reimburse you for the tuition? I don't think the results have supported, I do think that teachers need a lot more guidance. And right now they're told they can take whatever course they want, even if it's basket weaving. Not that I hope that they take that, but there is no.
Yeah, I think there's a couple differences in what Jason sort of had originally thought about. And the difference is, one would be that this is not like, go take a course, and if you do, then you can get reimbursed. Go take a course from schools of education, which aren't doing a particularly good job and probably don't have great courses to take. So that's one sort of difference. It was the professional development money that the district is currently spending on these sort of very one-size-fits-all type workshops and that sort of thing. Those aren't working. Let's think how to re-envision that. I think the second piece to this then that he was really thinking critically about was, how do we create the catalog of things that are super high quality from which they can choose? It's not just take the money and, go to a conference in Vegas. It was, here are the very specific, so if you are struggling on backwards planning or, whatever it might be, here's the menu of things that we think could be very helpful. Those have been vetted for quality. They have been specifically developed with the population of students that are in this district in mind. A lot of it is driven by the most effective teachers in our district, that sort of thing. So I'd say those would be the primary differences with kind of what we had thought about back then, and sort of, what you talked about, which I would 100% agree is not a good use of money and has not resulted in anything better.
Yeah, that was my first project in education 30 years ago, was to look at the transcripts of teachers in Baltimore City schools and what they did to earn advanced certification. And it was, a lot of things like how to operate a overhead projector. I'm showing my age, but that was not a good use of anyone's time.
Right. So I'm gonna attempt to combine a few topics into one. That could be dangerous, but go with me for a second here. So we haven't talked teacher compensation, and we haven't talked teacher professionalization. Often folks will put those two together. I'd love to just open it up to the panel. When we think about teacher comp, is that a key to teacher professionalization? If so, Is it standalone, or what else do we need to be thinking about? And let's push on. Are we seeing any innovative subsets or models or pilots across the country where we think folks are actually succeeding in shifting to a different paradigm about teachers and their professionalization? So just opening that up for the entire panel. How do we think about teacher comp? And then specifically, as it relates to teacher professionalization, is it a standalone, or what else needs to be in the mix as we think about teacher professionalization and the improvement of that, if you will? And is anybody doing something, innovative and pushing the envelope on this conversation of teacher professionalization? Don't all speak at once.
I'll weigh in. I think, first of all, compensation is I think a major part of valuing teachers and the professionalization of teaching. I think they go hand in hand, but I don't think that compensation alone is all we need. I think that there has to be more of a societal and cultural shift in order to really hold teachers in the esteem that they ought to be. And people give lip service to education in this country more than, anything. Every politician, every voter, education is important. So we talk so much about how valuable it is, but we don't act based on that, right? We don't, as a country, we don't show that we value education. And some of your questions have been about like the pandemic. So one of the examples that I give is like, look at the difference between what happened in Denmark when this pandemic hit as it pertained to getting kids back into school versus in the United States, right? So in Denmark, it was the national priority. We have to get kids back in school. So all of the resources of the government were focused on how are we going to build temporary classrooms so we can socially distance? How are we going to hire more folks so that there are, better student-teacher ratios? It was more important than parents going back to work. It was more important than restaurants opening back up. It was about how do we get our kids back in school? So it articulated to that entire country, this is the most important thing we can do. So if you flip that to what's happened in this country, it's like we've been talking about it, but who really has put any like significant resources towards this? I feel like school districts and charter schools have just all been struggling because there aren't a ton of resources. There aren't, there's no sort of game plan, right? So everyone has had to feel like they're sort of, recreating the wheel. And I feel like they've sort of been left out to kind of flap in the wind because we haven't done that. And I think until we as a country really stop just giving lip service to this, but really start to show through our actions that education is the most important thing that we can focus on, we're never going to see like the lifting of the teaching profession in the way that needs to happen.
Others, Mike, Ben, thoughts on this, the role of compensation and the overarching question around teacher professionalization?
Well, may I put up another chart?
You may.
Okay. So this is a variant. This is from Bob Costrell's website. This builds on a paper Bob and I published in EdNext, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago. So in the previous chart and Ben's comments, you saw that the public schools have just been adding more and more bodies to the payroll, far in excess of the number of kids. And every one of those individuals gets a current salary, but they're accruing deferred benefits in terms of pension funds. Many districts have retiree health insurance, and they're not properly funding those. This is a chart that shows how much in current dollars is being spent just on district costs for retirement benefits. So in starts, this is the first quarter that the Bureau of Labor Statistics broke out the data. In 2004, districts were spending $547 per student, or about 5% of per pupil expenditures on the pension. And by the way, this doesn't count Social Security either. And it doesn't count teacher contributions towards the pension. It's just the district contribution. By up to the most current data, which is pretty current, that's risen to about $1,500 per student, or about 11% of per pupil expenditures. Now, is this a smart investment? Well, these pensions are, as I said, they're underfunding. They're sucking up a lot of resources that could go to pay for new teachers, salaries for young teachers. But they also have, and we've written about this in Ed Next, they push teachers out in an early age. They created a powerful incentive to retire in your late 50s for a typical teacher, and that's what we see. So we got a lot more novice teachers to replace these teachers. They punish mobility between states. So if you move from Missouri, if you move from Kansas City, Missouri to Kansas City, Kansas, mid-career, you get an enormous loss in pension wealth. And so that's unprofessional, right? I mean, if I'm an economist, I can move from place to place. I won't take these kinds of hits. So these benefit costs are very burdensome. The burden is rising. And you don't see this with other professions. Most other college-trained professionals aren't in these kinds of systems because they move around, and employers don't. Neither the employers nor the employees see this as an efficient way to compensate professionals. So I'll stop it there.
Kate, any reactions to that?
Yeah, I'll just say back-ending the compensation is a good way to hide it from voters and elected officials. And that, I think that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Back-ending it and underfunding it. You're right.
All right. Kate, I think you're on mute, but I think we'd love to hear from you.
I was going to say it's been to the detriment of teachers, this back ending. Most teachers don't make it to the end and don't fully vest. And so it's not to the good of teachers. We really, teachers, we could do a lot to improve teacher quality by improving teacher pay. And we know the profession is underpaid. But when you look at charts like that, you can see, well, it's not because governments aren't sending resources into teaching. It's because it's done it's not done smartly.
Great. Thank you. I think we've got a host of questions for this panel from the audience. So I'll turn it over to CR to take it away here.
Yeah, let's do a couple questions from the attendees first, and then I know we have some fellow panelist questions. And Mike, the attendee, is requesting that we start with you on this first question. So they're asking, has central office staffing or bureaucracy staffing increased concurrently and or increased at the expense of teacher pay during those same periods?
I mean, administration was increasing relative to the increase in students. So you would think these would be fixed costs. Like my data was district administrators, but teacher pay was stagnant. So these were going, so we're increasing administrators, keeping teacher pay stagnant at the same time.
We have another article in Education Next, part of our Education Next corpus on pensions, that showed that school administrators and superintendents are actually the largest net beneficiaries from this backloaded system. They get by far and away the highest return. So they have no particular incentive to fix this feature of the compensation system because they're part of it.
All right. And then Mike and Ben, another question, I think we can start with you, is do these patterns that you've highlighted on the various slides vary greatly by state? Do they vary based upon, degree of unionization, degree of rural, or is the pattern the same across the 50?
I'm actually writing a paper on that right now, and we're basically getting no results. It's going on almost everywhere, and it doesn't seem to be explained by unionization. It doesn't seem to be explained by which states are getting richer faster in a per capita sense. Doesn't seem to be explained by special needs students increases or things like that. It just seems to be secular trends. Now, a couple of fast growing states, Nevada and Arizona, have not had really a staffing surge since 1992, but pretty much everyone else has, and the trends do vary by state, but it doesn't seem to be correlated with observable things that you think might be related to it.
Can I just add, there is, Ben's talking about changes in staffing and characteristics of states. There is a fair amount of cross-section variation in student-teacher ratios. Like Missouri is well below the national average. I think a factor in that is schools don't want to lay off people. So if you've got declining districts, like our rural districts, they don't want to close schools. They don't want to, in some sense, teachers are fixed costs. You got to have the first grade teacher, no matter how many first graders you have. And so I think, this depopulation of rural areas has helped make states like Missouri be below the national average. But there's a whole variety of factors that feed into this.
Great. Next, maybe we'll go over to Kate and Michelle on this one. The attendee, the audience member says, sure, salary is important to teachers, but so are working conditions, the environment in which they work, old buildings, poor heating and ventilation, decrepit furniture, lack of supplies. What factor is that playing in the teacher quality landscape?
I feel like when you drill down on what teachers mean by working conditions, it's less about whether the furnace is working, though I don't want to go to work in a building where the furnace doesn't work. And it's more about the quality of their colleagues and the quality of their principal. So working conditions it can be a pretty misleading term because it means a lot of things, but I think that there's nothing more demoralizing to a great teacher than to be surrounded by teachers who aren't working very hard, or to be putting up with a principal who doesn't honor the contribution that you're making. So I think if we want to improve the lives of teachers, we have to make sure that they have a great deal of collegiality with like-minded, dedicated folks who and they have to feel respected and honored by the folks that supervise them.
I would absolutely agree with that. I'd say that teachers largely correlate their working conditions to their management, right? What kind of environment is their manager, meaning their principal, creating for them every day?
All right, we had a couple of questions from fellow panelists as well. Mike Petrilli has a question for you, Ben. Isn't it the case that private schools have added tons of staff too and have tiny classes? Is this really only a public school thing, or is it a private school thing as well?
Well, I completely agree with Kate that parents want small class sizes. I mean, they say it in surveys, and also you observe it when they choose private schools, they have smaller class sizes, absolutely. Anecdotally, some private school, like association leaders, have told me kind of privately, we've had a staffing surge too. But then I don't have hard data on that. I'd love to see it if Mike has any. But I have heard that anecdotally that's going on as well.
I think Marguerite Rosa's done a really interesting work where they pay $2,500 or $5,000 to a teacher to take 4 more students, and that teacher is a superstar teacher. And parents at first, they divide up the kids, and the kids go to school and they've got a lot more kids in their class, and they come home complaining. The mom goes in and the principal says, well, if you want to go into Mrs. less good teacher's class, you can go there. And the parents tend to decline the opportunity. So I do think when parents are confronted with the reality of, the reality of the real stark choice, as Marguerite's done in her work, I think they do recognize they'd rather have the superstar teacher.
2 points on that. First, the private schools don't have all the administrator overhead that the public schools do. So the number of administrators per student and all these other non-teachers per student is much lower. But the second thing is we're sort of automatically connecting the student-teacher ratio with class size, and they aren't the same thing. So the national ratio of students to teachers is 16, okay? Now, that's a lot smaller than most classes you'll see. So the question is, lots of teachers are on the payroll and they have time off for preparation or some other duty or what have you. But there isn't, the two are separate. And a lot of people, when I show them the number, in Missouri, it's about 13.5 students per teacher. But that's, class sizes are larger than that typically. So they're on the payroll somewhere, but they might not be at that point in the classroom.
I'm gonna paraphrase one of our panelists that made a comment here in the chat. He says, we talk about Finland, we talk about the Finland paradigm, but if we went with the Finland way, we'd have way fewer teachers, and maybe folks don't realize that that would be the Finnish way if it was imported here to the States. Any reactions from anybody? Maybe Kate, we can start with you on that, because I know you've thought a lot about that.
You're just saying that the class sizes are bigger.
Well, I mean, just what's your reaction? People want to reference Finland. Do they really know everything that goes into the?
No,
Finland
I think we're over Finland now. I think Finland was yesterday's star. Their test scores have gone down in the basement again. So we don't talk about Finland anymore. But I think everybody cherry picks. I mean, the amount of cherry picking that went on with Finland was ridiculous. And, I cherry picked. I said, oh, they picked the top 10% of their graduating high school class to be teachers. And then I find out later, well, it's not quite that. But, so that's the risk of using international data. But I will say this. The big enemy to improving teacher quality is our lack of data. We don't have good supply data. We don't have good demand data. We don't have good salary data. I mean, there is just so much data that is missing so that people can run rampant with all sorts of scary newspaper stories about shortages or the amount of information that the decisions that get made in education based on fear mongering is frightening in itself. And until we start addressing foremost teacher supply and demand, but lots of other things, we're going to continue to have decisions made about class size, about, we continue to produce twice as many elementary teachers every year as we need, even in a time when people say there are chronic shortages. I mean, there are so many ramifications from our lack of good data that get far too little attention.
Hannah, back over to you for the final 2 minutes.
Great. Well, this is thank you to our panel, Kate and Mike and Ben and Michelle. Really good pushes, good data. I guess I'll close with one more effort and stab at optimism. As we look ahead, what's promising? are there things that we can either see that's happening out there that we should scale, or things that we're just hopeful, maybe unintended consequences of the pandemic that as we look ahead we should anticipate? So looking for I think most of what we've heard today, I'll just be candid, is it's not a great story about teacher effectiveness and quality. Is there anything that gives us hope for a different story 10 years from now, 15 years from now?
I would just say one quick thing, having lots of relatives and friends who in this new world order now are having to be at home with their kids. One sort of overarching sentiment that I've heard from people is, holy crap, this is hard, right? I've had friends who, work in education or in nonprofits who thought they knew education, and they're like, I try to teach my kids for 30 minutes and I can't even get through that without wanting to wring their necks. I don't know how teachers do it every day. And so I see that as maybe a hopeful and positive thing that comes out of this pandemic, is people understanding just how incredibly hard it is to be an effective teacher. And that acknowledgement hopefully translating into much higher respect for teachers generally, but also understanding of everything that goes into building an effective teacher.
Right. Well, I think we're at our 2-minute max here. I just want to thank each one of you for participating. This has been a joy and a privilege to hear from you all. And we also had as I said, I'm sure the most riveting panel of the day, because you only put the riveting panel at the end. I'm thrilled to have been a part, and thank you for your participation, and back to CR.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Michelle, Kate, Mike, Ben, and Hannah for that great final panel of the day. It is 5:30 Eastern, and without further delay, Professor Paul Peterson's going to come back and join us for final thoughts. You're on, Paul.
So yes, it was a great panel. You always leave the best to last because you want to keep as many people to the very end as you possibly can. It was a great panel. Thank you all. But we had so many great panels that's a little bit unfair to say that, but you certainly held your own. And we're supposed to have a big party now, but I think we're all so exhausted that we're probably going to let you all wind your way to dinner. I hope you have a very fine restaurant that practices social distancing. So thanks everybody for attending. Thank you, CR, for your masterful handling of the course of the day. I can't imagine. I think the very best decision I made with respect to this event was to select you to be the moderator. So thank you very much, CR, for all that.
Well, Paul, happy birthday. Thanks for the kind words, but happy birthday to you. This is your party. Happy birthday, my friend.
All right. Well, thanks to one and all.